Well, good evening. My name is Thorin Tritter. I am the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County, which is located in Glen Cove, New York. And I'm delighted to welcome you to our program this evening, our 2G Tuesday program. Our 2G Tuesday series builds on our successful monthly Sunday with Survivor programs, which have been running for the past year or so. And we hope that these 2G Tuesday series will provide a venue for the children of Holocaust survivors to share their parents' stories, safeguarding them for future generations. Tonight, Debbie Cohn will be sharing the story of her mother, Ilse Loeb, and a bit about her father, too. Before we get to her presentation, I want to just put in some plug for some upcoming programs. So tomorrow, I will be back for my next Curator's Corner, where I give a short presentation about particular objects or images in our museum. And I will be talking tomorrow about two photographs in our galleries that were taken at the liberation of Auschwitz, which took place on January 27th, 1945. We're coming up to the anniversary of that liberation, so I thought it appropriate to talk about some of those images that are in our galleries. I also want to mention a program that we have coming up this Sunday at 12:30 in the afternoon, a virtual program when historian and author Amy Butler Greenfield will be talking about her recent book, The Woman All Spies Fear, and sharing information about one of America's great code breakers during World War II, Elizabeth Smith Friedman. And finally, two programs on Thursday, January 20th, the first at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when HMTC is teaming up with the Museum of Jewish Heritage for a panel discussion entitled Nazis on Long Island, the story of Camp Siegfried. And then in the evening, next Thursday, I will be offering a virtual tour of Ellis Island, which opened 130 years ago this month. To learn more about any of those programs and to see a full list of our upcoming schedule, you can, of course, go to our website, www.hmtcli.org, and click on the events tab. And I also hope you'll go to our website and click on the Give Now button and make a donation to keep sponsoring virtual programs like the one this evening. Okay, with those announcements taken care of, let me stop sharing my screen. I would like to introduce the man who is behind both our Sunday with Survivor series and this 2G Tuesday program, and that is Mr. Michael Mantell. Michael is a 3G. Two of his grandparents are survivors, and they instilled in him the need to not let their history and the larger history of the Holocaust be forgotten. Michael reached out to us in 2020 to ask about arranging a survivor to speak for a group of his family members. And after that program, we had further discussions and realized we shouldn't limit this just to a small family gathering, but turn it into a public program. And thus our Sunday with Survivors programs were started. And then a couple of months ago, he reached out to me, he said, Thorin, why are we only doing survivors? Let's get 2G programs as well. And so we started the 2G Tuesday series. I'm grateful for Michael's continued support, the continued support of his family also. And I pass the baton to Michael to introduce more about our program this evening. Michael?
Thank you, Thorin. Thank you so much, as always. Thank you to you and to everyone at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center for all the incredible work that you do every single day and all the work that you do to put the Sundays with Survivors and 2G Tuesday programs together to make them the success that they are. Thank you to everyone joining us today and for those watching this recording. And a very special thank you to Debbie Cohn, who will be presenting the story of both her parents. I'd like to welcome everyone to 2G Tuesdays. And as Thorin said, 2G Tuesdays is a virtual platform that gives children of Holocaust survivors the opportunity to share their parents and family stories with all of us. At the end of our program, we invite everyone to ask questions or share comments during our Q&A portion. You can use the raise hand emoji if you know how to, or you can unmute yourself if we don't see your virtual or actual hand raised. One of the most wonderful parts of these programs is the interaction that we have at the end where we get to ask questions for all of our presenters. So I encourage everyone to think of questions or comments to share with us. It really enhances the experience. You can write your questions or comments in the chat as well, and Thor and I can read them at the end if you feel more comfortable that way. Before I turn the floor over to Debbie, I want to ask everyone to please save the date for our next Sundays with Survivors event, which will be held on Zoom on Sunday, January 23rd, featuring survivor Rosalie Simon. We hope to see all of you there, and please feel free to invite any friends and family to join us for all of these free online events. Again, thank you. And with that, I welcome Debbie.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. I'm Debbie Cohn, and I am second generation, meaning my parents were Holocaust survivors. And I share my parents' stories of survival because I know how prejudice and discrimination can destroy a family within a so-called civilized society. I know it only too well. But I also know that if it weren't for some good people who helped my mother would not have survived, and I would not be here to tell you the story. We know the Holocaust did not start with murder. It started with little acts of prejudice and bullying that mushroomed into something so horrible as the Holocaust. Here's a picture of my parents when they were children. There's my father on the left, Walter Loeb. He was probably about 8 years old in this photo. And my mother, Ilse Morgenstern, she was probably about 3 years old in that photo. And this is who I'm going to be talking about tonight. Of course, mainly about my mother, but a little bit about my father. So when I speak to students, I want to explain to them that when incidents like this happen, people play certain roles. And they have choices in these roles, except one role has no choice. So these are the roles that people play when bad things happen. We have the role of the victim or target. Now they want to use the word target because I guess the word victim sounds too helpless. But we know who the victims were in this case. There were 6 million Jewish victims, 6 million, which is crazy. And out of those 6 million, 1.5 million were children. So that means only 1 out of every 10 Jewish children survived. Only 1 out of 10. And that's a terrible statistic. My mother is one of those 1 out of 10 children who survived. But all Jews were victims, but not all victims were Jews, because there were other victims of Hitler and the Nazis, including people with mental and physical disabilities. The first mass murder was really of babies with disabilities, and they called it euthanasia, which of course we know that's not what it was. And there was Jehovah's Witnesses, there were gay men, political prisoners, political opponents of Hitler, Roma and Sinti, who we know as gypsies, but they prefer to be called Roma and Sinti. There were many other victims of Hitler. Then we have the role of the perpetrator or a bully or a criminal, and they're of course the person who commits that bad act, and that includes Hitler, the Nazis, other people who did all those terrible things. Then we have the collaborator. Those are people who assist the perpetrator. Hitler could not have accomplished what he did if it weren't for the fact that ordinary people went along with him. Ordinary people. Then we have the role of the bystander. Unfortunately, we have all been bystanders in our lives at one time or another. We see something bad happening, but we really don't intervene. We may not know how to intervene or what to say, or we're afraid of intervening, but the truth is we're still a bystander. Then we have the role of the upstander or hero or rescuer. And those are the people who really do stand up for another person or people and help them, and sometimes at risk to their own lives. Of course, we have firefighters and policemen and people like that, healthcare workers, all heroes. But in my case, if it weren't for upstanders, my mother would not have survived. My parents were from Germany and Austria. Here's where my mother's from. She was from the beautiful town of Vienna, Austria. That's where she was born. It's a city of music, art, culture, beautiful city. Then here's Germany, which of course Hitler was in charge of during this period, but he was really from Austria. He was Austrian. And my father was from a town called Birkenau, Germany. Here we go. Now, whenever my father would mention the word Birkenau, that was his hometown, often people would flinch because people who know anything about the Holocaust equated it with Auschwitz-Birkenau, of course. Birkenau, part of Auschwitz, was the death part of Auschwitz, and that's a terrible place. Has nothing to do with my father's town of Birkenau. My father's town of Birkenau was this, a beautiful, beautiful village. And the crazy thing about this picture is that here's my father, a black and white photo of my father, probably about age 8 or 9, overlooking the town. You see here, the same vantage point. And I just think it's crazy that I'm able to have this photo because my father's family dated back to that area to the 1600s. They were very German. They felt very German, just like we feel very American. But getting back to this map, so these are the countries that we're dealing with tonight that I'm going to be talking about. So Austria, Germany, and the Netherlands. Well, people often think of a Holocaust survivor as a concentration camp survivor, but my mother survived a different way. She was what we now call a hidden child, a hidden child. Now we know probably the most famous hidden child is Anne Frank over here. Anne Frank was an amazing person, and she was hidden with her family, and my mother was also hidden, ultimately had to hide away from the Nazis, otherwise she would get caught and probably would never have survived. Well, my mother had a lot of parallels to the story of Anne Frank with one very large difference. My mother survived. Anne Frank did not. Anne Frank and her family were betrayed. And it was a terrible thing, whoever betrayed them, because whoever did that was doing just as bad as the Nazis who picked them up, whoever betrayed them. And Anne Frank died of illness right before she would have been liberated. A very sad thing. But we do have her diary that has been read by many, many people throughout the world, and it's just incredible what she did. So the other things about the similarities and differences with my mother and Anne Frank is that Anne Frank was hidden with her family. My mother was not. Many parents had to make the most difficult decision a parent would have to make, the most difficult decision, and send their child off to be hidden because they knew they themselves couldn't leave or get out, but they were trying to save their child. And so they had to make what a gut-wrenching decision to have your child go off, knowing that you yourself may not be saved. And of course, that's what happened in my mother's case. Her parents had to make that terrible decision. Anne Frank was hidden in a secret annex in Amsterdam. Many of the hidden children had to hide in unusual places in convents, homes, orphanages, forests, pigsties, even sewers, attics, barns, and cellars. They had to do anything they could to survive, and they had to hide in crazy places. So let me first show you my mother's childhood in Austria. My mother, these two photos are in the very first gallery of the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center in Glen Cove. Our first gallery highlights local survivors and their relatives and shows their life before the war. And so we call it our family album. So here, if you ever go to the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, please look for these two photos because you'll say, oh, well, I know who that is because you've now met me. So here's a photo of my mother on vacation with her parents outside of Vienna around age 5. She remembers when my grandfather, when they took this photo, my grandfather took the hat from his head and put it on my mother, and they snapped the photo. And obviously she was very happy and had a very nice childhood. Here is just 2 years later, around 2 years later, my mother was sitting on the lap of her grandmother, my great-grandmother, in her apartment in Vienna. And again, happy childhood. My great-grandmother did not She died before the Holocaust, before Hitler came to power in Vienna. So it was kind of a fortunate thing because she was a very elderly woman, as you could see, and she would never have survived this whole experience.
Down 16 flights of that stairwell. Black
Somebody's
smoke.
not muted.
Felix collapsed somewhere along the way.
Yeah. Unmute. Okay. So imagine for a moment that you're 13 years old and you have to take a train to a foreign country all by yourself. You say goodbye to your parents at the train station, and that is the very last time that you will see your parents again. That is what happened to my mother. And it happened to her for one reason. It happened because of prejudice and discrimination of the Jewish people. So my mother was 12 years old and living in Vienna, Austria, when something happened. It was called the Anschluss. Now, remember, Hitler was in charge of Germany from 1933 on, and things were going very bad for the Jews at that point. But my father always said it took Hitler 5 years to accomplish in Germany what it took 1 day to accomplish in Austria. It was the Anschluss. So, meaning the annexation of Austria into Nazi Germany in March of 1938. And my mother always said that most of the Austrian people welcomed Hitler and his Nazis with open arms. He came into great fanfare. As you see here, he's talking in a square here. There's thousands of people listening to him. He's very mesmerizing when he's speaking. He's shouting. You don't even have to understand the words he's saying because he's so influential and charismatic. So my mother, saw what was happening. It was terrible. And immediately Jews were subject to public humiliation. You see here a Jewish boy being forced to paint the word Judah on his father's store. Very humiliating. And people are just watching this. And my mother remembers, she remembers they made the older Jewish men from the town scrub the sidewalks with toothbrushes to humiliate them. And it was very bad. And people would just watch or cheer on. So they're all being collaborators, not just bystanders at that point. So my mother's life changed overnight when the Anschluss happened. And the next slide I'm going to show you, my mother's going to be a much older woman, but she's going to be retelling the story of what happened to her when she was 12 years old.
When Hitler came to power, I remember that day when my father stood at the window and saw the tanks coming in and the motorcycles. And he said to us, my mother and me and my brother, we are in for very hard times. But in our wildest dreams, we wouldn't have thought how hard. And the very next day, within 24 hours, things changed already. I saw some stores being vandalized on my way to school. Of course, we always walked to school. There was no school bus. And when I got into my classroom, I was sitting down on my desk, and the girl that sat next to me, who I was talking to the whole school year, and she was not a good friend, but, we were good acquaintances. She suddenly came over to my desk, looked me in the eye, and said, "You dirty Jew," and spit into my face. And she did that knowing that I was not going to complain to the teacher, because the teacher was confused, like everybody was confused what to do. But they knew that if they were helping Jewish people, they were going to be in trouble too. So I didn't do anything, but it certainly, the memory has stayed in my mind forever, as long as I live, because I couldn't understand where she suddenly had this terrible hatred.
So it's a kind of a sad story, but many of the students can relate to this because this is obviously an act of bullying, and nobody really stood up for my mother at that time. Now, my mother is holding this autograph book in this photo. This autograph book is something she had when she was, in school, and she had her friends write beautiful poems or drawings in there. Her teachers, her principal even wrote in there. And when my mother went into hiding, she actually had to put the autograph book and those photos that I showed you earlier all in a tin box and buried them outside by a tree. And she buried them there because she wanted to preserve her family photos. And so at the end of her whole hiding time, she was able to dig up that box in the ground and retrieve her photos and this autograph book. And that's the only way that I even know what my grandparents looked like, because she had those family photos. Now, this is one of the pages from her autograph book. And this page was written just a few years before the incident that happened in school with the Anschluss. And you would never believe, this poem is titled Friendship and Remembrance. It's in German, of course. And it's actually written, like I said, a few years before the incident, but you wouldn't believe who wrote it. It's actually that girl, that same girl who just a few years later spit into my mother's face, wrote this nice thing in her autograph book. So it just shows you how easily influenced people can be by the rest of the people, and they just kind of go along with it. So then many laws start getting passed, and segregating the Jews. Here, the sign "Juden verboten," Jews forbidden, and a woman sitting on a bench only for Jews, and she looks kind of embarrassed. Segregation is something that happened in our country, of course, so this is the same kind of thing. And my mother remembers there was a sign in front of the park right by her apartment in Vienna that she was always going to the park, and they put up the same kind of sign, "No Jews allowed." So my mother was no longer allowed to even step foot in that park. And she also had to be segregated from her school. One day she was told, "You're not allowed to go to your school anymore. All Jewish kids now have to go to a separate school." So my mother had to go 20 blocks, walk 20 blocks to a school where only Jewish kids were allowed. Then the Nazis started taking away all the Jewish-owned businesses. You see here, there's a swastika painted on a Jewish business. So my grandfather had a printing shop in Vienna, and my mother's going to tell you what happened there.
He said to my father, "You have to get out of here right now, because this place is not yours anymore. It belongs to us." And so my father stepped out of the store for good and used to stand on the other side of the store, staring at the place, which had now in front a big swastika.
Yeah, my mother used to say that she remembers her father staying there crying because, they took everything away from him that he had worked for, and she has no idea how he was able to even manage with money after that point. So things are going really bad for the Jews at this point, and then comes an infamous night in history, Kristallnacht, November 9th and 10th, 1938. Very infamous night, a turning point in Holocaust history, when the Nazis staged violent attacks against the Jewish communities in the areas where they were in charge. At that point, they were in charge of Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland, which had been part of Czechoslovakia. And they destroyed synagogues. They put hundreds of them on fire, as you see here in this photo. The fire department would not come to put out the flames. Only if it would endanger a non-Jewish home or business next door would they do that. They shattered the glass storefronts of Jewish-owned businesses. That's why it's called the Night of Broken Glass, of course, you see here. And there were glass shards all over the streets. They also arrested 30,000 Jewish men that night. And out of those 30,000 Jewish men, my father was one of them. My father was arrested and sent to Dachau concentration camp, which shows you this is not ancient history. My father, who was in Germany at the time, was arrested, and of course they told him you're in protective custody. They always use euphemisms. And he had a terrible time there. He lost a lot of weight. He had frostbite on his hands. They had almost, very thin uniform to wear, and it was bitter cold. He had to march all day long. And it was an unusual circumstance because my father was only there a short time. Hitler called them the November Jews. And he kind of was trying to figure out, what am I going to do with all these Jews? I don't want them here. I want them to leave. And I also want to see what the rest of the world is going to do. And he actually released the Jews at that time, but it was the only time prisoners were released from a concentration camp. That was the only time. And when they were about to release my father, he had the frostbite, and they said, "Oh, we can't release you yet because we want people to think we treated you well. So we're going to heal your frostbite first, and then we're going to discharge you. But you are to tell everybody we treated you well, and you are to leave the country within 90 days, or else we're going to come get you, and you'll never get out. We're going to find you and take you back, and then you're never coming out." Well, my father could not, he did get out of Dachau, but he couldn't leave the country within 90 days. It was impossible. It was very hard to get out of there, to get the right paperwork and everything. So he ultimately was lucky enough to get out in March of 1940, which is quite a while later. And he very, very lucky, because at that point, very few people were able to leave. And my father did come over to the United States. He's the only one from his family to be able to come here. And he actually was then in the United States Army. So he was not a Richie boy. If anybody of you saw 60 Minutes recently about the Richie boys, but he had a similar thing where he was a German Jew, but his was a little bit different because he was already a Holocaust survivor over there, and then came over here and was in the United States Army. So we're actually very proud of that. So things really got bad after Kristallnacht. Oh, this is showing you my father's arrest record at Dachau. So here you have it, the actual record. Walter Loeb, Birkenau, his hometown, his prison number, protective custody, Jew. It's really ridiculous. So my mother and her family were forced out of their apartment right after Kristallnacht. My mother's going to tell you.
We were told on Kristallnacht, when they came to our apartment, to pack a few belongings because we were now told to go to live with another family in the building that we did not know, also Jewish people. They made I guess they lived on a top floor, there was no elevator, so our apartment was more desirable for them to move in there. So we had so little time to pack things that about a week or so later, my father had to get special permission to go back into our apartment to pick up some more of our belongings that we needed for our daily lives. And imagine, our own things, we had to ask permission to get them. And they told us that we could do that a certain morning, that 3 men would come with us and watch everything we were taking. You could take no jewelry. And that's when I picked up the watch. My mother had said, maybe they won't watch you as much as they will watch us. If you can, maybe you can get Dad's watch that's on the night table. And I did.
So what my mother's talking about with the watch, this is not the actual watch. This is a replica. But my grandfather had a gold pocket watch, a beautiful gold pocket watch that my mother was able to get, and it remained after the war. We don't have the actual watch anymore, but we do have a gold chain. My sister has a gold chain, and it's, of course, a very valuable heirloom to our family. And my mother's holding an ice skate in this photo. And what that is about is when my mother went into hiding, she gave her ice skates. My mother used to like to ice skate a lot. And she gave her ice skates to a non-Jewish man for safekeeping, along with some other belongings. She also gave him a whole stack of letters from her mother. Her mother had written her letters. And at the end of her hiding time, when she came to this non-Jewish man and she said, "Oh, do you have my things? Do you have my things?" He said, "Well, I do have your ice skates. I kept them. Here they are. But I'm so sorry. I was so afraid to keep your mother's letters. I was so afraid that somebody would say, 'Why are you keeping this Jewish girl's letters here? I don't understand it.'" So he thought he was going to get in trouble. So he burned the letters. So obviously my mother was upset about it, but she understood why he had to do that. So at this point, my mother and her parents knew it was so dangerous to stay in Vienna for the Jews. It just was not good. So they had to get out. But how could they get out? Where would they go? Who would take them? And that's when my grandparents had to make that most difficult decision, to send my mother off by herself, because here's a picture of my grandmother Elvira, my grandfather Max, is my mother. She was only 13 in this photo. She looks a little bit older, but she's only 13. That's her brother Felix, my uncle. He was actually from my grandmother's first marriage, so he's actually 12 years older than my mother. And this photo was taken just the day before my mother was going to have to leave her parents. They were securing her. She had the right papers to go leave Vienna to go to the Netherlands. But again, she had to go by herself. She couldn't go with her parents. And my grandparents made that terrible decision to send her off without them, knowing they may never see her again. And my mother remembers before they took this photo, that my grandmother made her have her hair done, and she put on a nice dress. And this collar, by the way, was hand crocheted by my grandmother. And she wanted my mother to make a good impression on the people that she was going to in the Netherlands. So now I'm going to tell you about her voyage to the Netherlands. My mother had to go from Vienna all the way through Germany into the Netherlands here, where she was supposedly going to be safe, because at that point, the Netherlands was not occupied yet by the Nazis and Hitler. So they thought it was going to be safe for her, and her cousin was going to arrange for my mother to be safe. So she's going to tell you about her train ride. And remember, she was only 13.
Bye to my parents that day. We did not realize that it was going to be the last time that I would see my parents. I don't think either one of us could have done it if we had known that, separate like this. But it was good that I didn't know. And I stepped on the train by myself. It was a very long ride from Vienna to the border of the Netherlands, and was only allowed to take 10 mark, which is about $4 or $5, with me. That's all I was allowed. Not enough money to even come back to Vienna in case I wouldn't be able to enter the Netherlands. But my parents were thinking of that, and they had somebody nearby the border who lived there and would then take me in for a while until, I could get back to Vienna. So when we arrived at the railroads, at the border of the Netherlands, the train, of course, stopped at a station, and a German secret policeman walked in to check the passports. And when he took my passport, he looked at the first page, which had a huge red J, just like everybody Jewish who was Jewish had to have that in their passport, so they could identify immediately if you were Jewish. And so when he saw the red J, he gave me a look that I have never forgotten in my whole life, because it was a look of disgust, of rejection, of not even wanting to talk to me. I wasn't worthy of speaking with him. And He took my passport and put it in his pocket. When I saw that, I thought to myself, as young as I was, how will I get to freedom without my passport? I stood in line for a long time to get this document. I must get my passport back. And I started to pick up my little luggage I had and ran after him. And suddenly I didn't see him there were so many people on that train. And when I looked out the window of the train, I saw him standing on the platform. So I had to get off the train. And when I went up to him, I said, "Please give me my passport back." He said, "No, you're too old. They will not let you in the Netherlands." I said, "Yes, I'm 13, just what it says on my passport." I guess I looked a little older than I really was. But no matter how I pleaded with him, he wouldn't give it back. And then I had my first lucky star. And I had so many after that, too. That's why I survived all those years. I suddenly saw another man in uniform standing nearby. I ran up to him and said to him, "He won't give me my passport back." And he walked over to the other man in uniform, and luckily for me, he was the other man's superior. And he said to him, "Give her passport back." So he had to do it. And so I finally got my passport back and wanted to step back on the train, and the train was pulling out. I knew my cousin was waiting for me at the Dutch border, which was only about 10, 15 minutes away. And I was deserted. I didn't know what to do next. Just had those 10 mark in my pocket. And I went to a place at the station that was like Morse code. There were no cell phones in those days, no, and only a public telephone there and so on. And I said to him, I must have page my cousin in the Dutch town that he's waiting for me and I will be coming just a little later. And I had to give him half of my 10 mark. And my cousin came on the phone, the public phone, and I told him the next train will be in 3 hours. And that's exactly what happened. I stepped on the train 3 hours later and got to Zevenaar and was now in the Netherlands. And
So that's quite a story. My mother retold that story many times to me and my siblings and other people because it was very traumatic. But when my mother demanded her passport back, that was an act of resistance. And I'm often asked by students, why didn't the Jews resist? And I tell them they all resisted in many ways, so many ways. And I tell them that they should go and research about resistance because there's just too much to tell about it. And every single person who did survive resisted just by virtue of surviving. So, of course, there were so many ways that they resisted. Well, then, so my mother was in the Netherlands, but then in May of 1940, Hitler invades the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Belgium, France, and things are going badly for the Jews there too. Just as badly as it had been for my mother in Austria, now it's just as bad. She is forced to wear this yellow star. It says Jew in Dutch, Jood. We have a star just like this one in the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center in Glen Cove, and that's my mother's. And so, of course, she realized maybe she escaped to the wrong country. And then she received a letter just like this one. This is a letter, the exact kind of letter that Anne Frank's sister Margot received, probably on the same day or right around the same time. They received the same letter because they both were targeted around the same time. My mother was targeted. She was one of the first to be targeted and one of the last to be freed of all the hidden children. So she was targeted because she was registered as a foreign Jewish child in the Netherlands. She was from Austria, and they had lists of this. So they found my mother on the list, and they sent this letter to her. The letter was a letter to be deported at midnight to a labor camp, and they tell you what things to bring with you on the letter. Now, when my mother got this letter, all the people around her said, "This is not a good idea to go there. Do not go on that train to whatever camp this is." They wouldn't explain what they were going to do to you there, of course. Well, at the same time, the Frank family made that same decision. They said, "Oh no, Margot cannot go on this train." At the same time, the Franks went into hiding. My mother went into hiding in the same country. Now, what was hiding? That was a crazy concept. You had to disappear from your life as you knew it, just completely disappear. And my mother, like I said before, was hidden one of the longest of all the hidden children. My mother had no idea how long it was going to be. It ended up being 1 month less than 3 years. 3 years. So my mother had to hide in 2 different ways. She had to physically hide, and of course you need people to hide you who are willing to take that risk. And she had to hide her Jewish identity. So she was given by the Dutch underground, a wonderful resistance movement, false papers and a new identity. So here she was. The Dutch underground was risking their lives. Some of them were Jewish, some were not Jewish. And they would go sometimes into the German headquarters and take the documents and falsify them and then give them to Jews to help them. And here my mother got papers to say she was no longer Ilse Morgenstern. She was now going to become a Dutch Christian girl named Joppie Lach. And she had to brainwash herself to think, I'm no longer Ilse Morgenstern, I'm now Joppie Lach. And she always said it was luck, but it was really luck to her because she had so much luck along the way because all the survivors had to survive with a lot of luck. So most of my mother's hiding time was spent with her cousin Adie. I hope you hear me now. She was hidden with her cousin Adie, who was a blonde, blue-eyed Jewish man, who, of course, because he was my mother's cousin, he was Jewish, but he had a non-Jewish fiance named Nikki. And they were living in a house outside of Amsterdam in a town called Laren. And everything was in Nikki's name, the papers and everything. So because she wasn't Jewish, they thought, let my mother hide there with them and hopefully it'll work out. Adie was very bold and brazen, and even though he was Jewish, he had false papers to say he wasn't Jewish, and he didn't want to physically hide. He would go out and be very daring and just kind of take it to the Germans in a way, and was never really caught. But my mother, of course, did feel like she had to physically hide. It was too dangerous. So before I show you the next slide, I'm going to explain. So my mother was with Nikki and Adie for a lot of the time in Laren. But at one point, Nikki's sister was getting married in Amsterdam. And they decided to take my mother with them. They didn't want to leave her by herself. So they took her to Nikki's parents' apartment in Amsterdam. And the problem was the new groom was a Nazi sympathizer, they thought. And they couldn't tell him that his future in-laws and everybody were hiding a Jewish girl. So they had the wedding downstairs in the apartment. And for 3 days, they had this wedding with festivities. But what they did was they couldn't let this guy know that my mother was hiding. So they put her upstairs in a room, and they put a piece of furniture, an armoire, just like this one, not this one, but just like this one, in front of the opening to the room to pretend that there was no room. And for those 3 days, my mother had to be behind an armoire like this. They shoved the food underneath the whole time. She had to be very quiet because they were all downstairs celebrating with the music and dancing and food. And she had no bathroom in there. She had just like a pail to use. And that was only 3 days out of the 3 years of hiding, just to give you a small little snippet. So then when my mother went back to Lauren with them, there was a very close encounter. And she only had 5 seconds to go into a predetermined hiding spot. So this is not my mother's hiding spot, but it was just like this one. This is actually in a museum in Holland. It's showing somebody else's hiding spot. My mother only had 5 seconds to go to hide, and they had already cut out a hole in the wall in paneling, and of course they had paneling to cover it. So my mother had to go into the wall, and they put the paneling in front of her, and she hid there while the Nazis searched the house for Jews. My mother was terrified, but they did not find her that day because I wouldn't be here to tell you about the story. Now, because the Jews knew that the Nazis knew that the Jews made hiding places, and the Nazis maybe didn't find them the first time they looked, they would know that the Jews would come out of their hiding spots and relax a little bit. And so, the Nazis would come back to search for the Jews again. So my mother and Adie and Nikki knew she had to find a new hiding spot. Instead of being in this house in Lauren, she had to go somewhere else, and they had to find somebody they could trust. And they found a couple that actually became relatively famous after the war. And this is them, Jotje and Art Vos. They were a Dutch Christian couple who were amazing people. They worked with the Dutch underground. And what was so incredible about them is that they not only risked their own lives, but they risked their young children's lives to hide 36 people throughout the course of the war. One of those 36 people was my mother. They saved my mother's life. And the way they were so successful in doing this, it's actually been the subject of movies and everything, so I'll let you know that at the end. But there was a Dutch police officer from the town who was pretending to work with the Nazis, but he actually was not, he didn't like the Nazis and what they were doing to the Jews. So he gave Mr. Voss a telephone because they didn't all have telephones. And he said, I'm going to pretend that you're now the fire marshal. That's why you have a phone. And instead, when I'm told when the Nazis are coming to search for Jews, I'm going to ring your phone twice and hang up. That's my signal that the Nazis are coming. And that was very dangerous for him to do this, and it was quite heroic. And what the Vosses had done was they had an art studio in the back. They were very artistic people, and it was an artistic area. And they dug a tunnel from that art studio to the outside to a field. It was actually by like the woods. They were at the end of the road. And this is showing you the opening of the tunnel outside. So when they were warned that the Nazis were coming to search, they would say to the Jews, run, go into the tunnel and hide and disperse. And they would go into that tunnel and they would disperse. And it really worked. Now, I want to show you this photo. It's an incredible photo. It shows 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 little children. These are not children hiding, they're children playing. These 3 little blonde girls and the boy were the Vosses' children. This little dark-haired girl is a Jewish girl named Moana, who was being hidden by the Vosses. She was just one of the people that they were hiding, among others. Moana was hidden there without her parents. And at the end of the war, she found out her parents did not survive. So, and they had to pretend that she was their sister. And they had to go to school as young as they were and keep this huge secret from all their classmates and all their teachers that their parents were doing all this, that they were hiding. Because if they were caught, they would all be sent to concentration camps, and it was not good. Then came the Hunger Winter, 1944 to 45. It was a terrible winter. where Germany cut off all the food and fuel supplies to that part of Holland where my mother was. And many people died of starvation, of being frozen, malnutrition, all kinds of horrible things. It was still, the war wasn't over. It was still hard. And her part of Holland was like the last to be liberated. So I'm just going to read you something that she wrote about what happened to her during the Hunger Winter, because every survivor has stories where moments meant the difference between life and death. And this is just one of her stories. The winter of 1944 to 45 was one of the coldest of the century. And in Holland, where I spent the war years, we had no gas or electricity during that time. We were always hungry, and we had to think of unique ways to cook our measly potatoes. So we would go out into the woods in the dark of the night to cut down trees, which we carried to the house to cut up into small pieces. One night, as we were chopping down a fairly large tree, we saw it swaying back and forth, either towards the forest or the road. All of a sudden, I heard the sound of a Gestapo jeep. As the jeep was about to pass, the tree was about to fall. In those few seconds, my life hung in the balance. The jeep disappeared into the distance, and the tree fell across the road, just at the very spot the jeep had just traveled. What would have happened had the tree fallen on top just before the jeep arrived, or fallen on top of it? I don't have the answer to that question, but I know that those few seconds saved my life. So finally, my mother is liberated. That part of Holland is liberated May 5th, 1945. She's finally free. Here's a picture of her with Nikki's sister, Adie, and Nikki, and they're kind of frolicking around. Of course, my mother had not really gotten much fresh air in all those years, so she was happy to be outside. However, she then found out the terrible, terrible truth that my grandparents, Max and Elvira, were murdered in most likely Belzec death camp. They were originally, she found out more and more information as the years went on, what happened to her parents, what the fate was. And sometimes she didn't want to know, but she found out that they were initially sent to a holding camp called Itzpika. And it was a horrible, horrible place where they tortured people, and it was just terrible. And then ultimately from there, they would send them to Belzec, where nobody survived. It was a murder machine, a killing center, and it was terrible. So even after this final thing, where my mother's all by herself now in the Netherlands, and finding out that her parents were murdered, and she has to make a life for herself, she's in the Netherlands and wanted to become a nurse. So she goes to a local hospital and starts doing very menial work there and wants to get into the nursing program. And they did a physical on her. And when they took her x-ray, chest x-ray, they came out and said, "I'm so sorry, you will never be a nurse," which were words that really stuck with her. And that's because she had tuberculosis. All those years of hiding, she had developed a terrible cough, and of course it was terrible malnutrition and all that. So she had tuberculosis, and there was no medication at that time. We have it now, but not then. And they put her in a sanatorium for almost a year, and she actually did get better, which is a miracle. And ultimately was able to come to the United States of America in 1947 and reunite with her brother, Felix, and his wife, Marion, who were in Chicago. And that's where my parents met. They met in Chicago. And this is what we call two survivors' best revenge. This is, part of the family. My parents, at their 60th wedding anniversary, we made them a big party. My father was 92, and in this photo, and he was very sick at this point, but they were married 60 years, and right a month after this party, my father passed away, but at least he was able to live to the age of 92. My mother passed away later. She was younger than my father. She passed away at the age of 94, and at the age of her death, she had at the time of her death, she had 4 children, 7 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. So that's what happened. And I like to end with gratitude, because these are the people who helped my mother. I mean, some of the people helped my mother. This is my mother with Nikki, and luckily she was able to reunite with her rescuers, which is also very unusual. Many survivors were never able to reunite with the people who saved them, but my mother was. We went back to Holland actually and found Nikki, and Nikki passed away after this, so it was good that my mother got to see her. And the amazing thing about the Vosses is that my mother was able to find them too, and they had moved from the Netherlands to Woodstock, New York. Crazy. And very unusual situation that she reunited with her rescuers and that they actually even spoke together to school groups. Yocha would speak with, and my mother, Art, of course, passed away before Yocha. But here's a picture taken many years ago of Yocha, her grandson, my mother, myself, and my daughter, who's now a grown woman. But it's just showing you how we had such a nice relationship with them, which was wonderful. So I'm going to end with that, and I really hope that you have questions. Thank you.
That was incredible, Debbie. Thank you so much. That was such an incredible, moving presentation. I can't thank you enough. Wow. I know people will have questions and comments throughout. We had a few comments that this was such an incredible presentation while you were speaking.
I actually, if anybody has a question, I really prefer that they actually ask it verbally than in the chat. I don't like seeing the words go across.
Maybe I can start off with a question. In some of the videos, you're next to your mother while she's speaking and sharing her story. So I'd just love to ask, like, what is it like to first hear those stories and now be the person who is sharing those stories to make sure that they live on?
Well, I mean, my mother was very different than a lot of survivors. I know so many second gens whose parents never spoke about it. My mother was very, very vocal. I think it helped her every time she spoke, and it helps me too, actually. Every time I speak, it helps me. Because it's a lot of trauma. And she spoke about these stories throughout my whole childhood. Remember, I'm the youngest of 4 kids, and by the time I came along, it was like just there every day of our lives. And the thing was, I didn't really know how to tell the story. And my mother actually had an exhibit that she curated in Rockland County on hidden children. And it was amazing. She had 17 hidden children come to my house like every week and start talking. And some of them wouldn't say anything. They were so traumatized. And then when they did start speaking, they wouldn't stop. And then my mother decided we have to share this with everybody. So she made a whole hidden child exhibit, and it used to travel around the country. And I had no idea about the Holocaust Center in Glen Cove. And I lived not far from there, like 15 minutes away. And my mother says, you know, Debbie, I'm going to try to get it to the place in Glen Cove. So she went over there, and the woman at the time who was the education director took my mother's exhibit. And when she took the exhibit, my parents lived in New Jersey at that time, far away. So I said, I have to really know my parents' stories because I'm going to be telling it to people when they go there. I mean, it makes so much more impact when they see an actual human who's connected to it. So I had to do a lot of work to get the presentations right because my mother would tell me this little story and that little story. And I had to know, well, what do you mean? How did you get from here to there? And what was the chronology of it? So I did lots and lots of interviews. And so I did it. And my mother knew I was doing this because she was still alive when I started doing this. And she was very happy. And my sister does it too. I have a sister who does Holocaust education.
Amazing, thank you. I just want to say these Sundays with Survivors and 2G Tuesdays have inspired me and my father to want to tell his parents' story. So thank you for that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Debbie. Very touching story. Very touching.
Thank you.
April Zygmunt, I'd love for you to ask your question. Yeah.
April, you just need to unmute first.
apparently what's going around now is how all these Nazi supporters, of course, are going after the Jews in full force. And I am thinking about what's going to happen. I mean, first of all, they're in Long Island, one of these strong groups, and apparently they're going after us. And the other thing I want to mention is that in the South, they are now giving courses in high school, whether the Holocaust did really exist, and teaching this to high school students. And those two things I think are pretty scary. And I'm wondering whether you think, it's not a real question, what do you think about these two things? I mean, it frightened me tremendously, but.
What do I think? I think that the Holocaust Center is very aware of all that you're saying and trying to combat it. And that's the whole point, is that we're trying to educate. What I get upset about is that we're usually preaching to the choir. So that's the piece that I'm trying to, and the Holocaust Center tries also to reach out to people who don't know about it. But the only way to do it is through education. And that's what we're trying to do, education. I mean, ignorance is no good. And there was a survivor, he's no longer with us, David Gewirtzman. He was an amazing, amazing man. And he made the most incredible statement. He said, instead of weapons of mass destruction, I use weapons of mass instruction. And I think that that's just great. I mean, what can you do? You can only do what you could, so much. But that's why I do this work, because I'm trying to educate people. And then hopefully those people will then spread the word further.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. I know Susan Halpern has a question, and then maybe we can go to Linda and Barbara.
How did your mother escape notice by the neighbors of Art and his wife?
Well, they were all very careful. I mean, it was very, very difficult. But it wasn't just my mother. They were hiding 36 people, not usually at the same time. But I mean, it's a long story, but it's incredible that they were not detected. I mean, Yocha Voss was a very good actress. She was a brilliant woman, and she was great. When the Nazis would come, she would somehow fool them, or maybe they knew, but they pretended to look the other way. We don't know. So, but you could look them up, because there's a lot. Oh, I was saying that years ago, Barbara Streisand produced several movies for Showtime called Rescuers Stories of Courage. And one of the movies was called Rescuer Stories of Courage, Two Couples. And the first hour, it's a dramatic movie, but the first hour is about the Vosses. And of course, they've also been in another movie called Secret Lives that talks about people who hate people. So they've been documented. And there's a tree in Yad Vashem for them, on the Righteous Avenue of the Righteous. There's also the picture I showed you in my PowerPoint of the two of them is in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. When you go through the museum and you see the rescuers, it goes by country. And when you get, and usually it's just names. But when you get to the Netherlands, it'll be a paragraph and their photo, because they saved so many. So you can look for that if you ever go back to the Holocaust Museum in Washington.
Linda?
Hi, Debbie. That was wonderful. It's so moving. I wondered how your mother's brother survived.
My mother's brother, Felix, he, like as I said, he was 12 years older. And during Kristallnacht, he really had to evade the Nazis and go into alleyways and hide all night and everything. But he somehow was able to escape illegally into the Netherlands. What had happened was he was in the Netherlands in the summer of 1938. The parents had sent him there, and unfortunately, one of his relatives sent him back to Vienna, which was like terrible that she did that, and a terrible thing. But so he tried to get back to, because when he was in the summer of 1938, he met his future wife. They fell in love at first sight. And so he wanted to go back to the Netherlands and find her and try to figure out where to go and what to do. So he was able to somehow, get there illegally to the Netherlands, reunited with Marion. They got married there. And then she had relatives in the United States that had the papers for them. You had to have some sort of connection. And they were able to come over on one of the last ships to leave. And they came over to the United States. So he was here the whole time. And he actually wanted my mother to come over here to join him before she went into hiding. And he had papers for her, but not for the parents. And so my mother said, no, I still have to wait for my parents to join me here in the Netherlands. I can't leave them here in Europe. And had she come here at that time, of course, it would have saved her all of those years of hiding. But she said she never regretted the decision because she would have felt so guilty leaving her parents in Europe to end their fate. So that's what happened.
Barbara?
Hi, Debbie. I really was very moved by your presentation. You did a wonderful job.
Thank
And
you.
I don't know if you remember, but years ago when I first met you and you would do the your parents' story in the old room in the Holocaust Center, in that big room by the kitchen, and you kept insisting that I had to do it. You kept pushing me, you have to do it. And thank you for doing that.
Oh, I'm glad. Thank you for saying that.
Sure.
I don't know if anyone else has their hand raised. I know Sandy Cooper had a question, and if anyone else does as well, please feel free. Oh, Sandy, I just have to unmute.
Debbie can hear me.
Yeah,
So
hi.
Debbie, you're not going to believe this, but I grew up in Rockland County and I was very little and I needed my pants hemmed all the time. And I met your mother, and your mother was and has been, I can't even explain it to you. My family, my kids know your mother's name because your mother said many things when she was hemming my pants. One of the things she said to me that stays with me every day, and if my kids were here, they would tell you, oh my God, this is all my mother ever said. Your mother said to me, and I think, April, you'll appreciate this. Your mother said to me one day, you know, the next time it comes back, it won't come back in a Nazi flag. It will be coming back wrapped in an American flag. So be careful.
Mm.
And I listened to that. I remember getting in the car afterwards and saying to my mother, I was young, what exactly is she trying to tell me? But when I heard that you were doing this and I could get to see a picture of your mother and I could tell my kids and my sister, oh my God, I mean, your mother is a household name for us. So
Well,
this has been amazing, and seeing her
okay,
face
glad.
and hearing her voice, and what a gift.
Just to tell you, my mother spoke very, very often. She was a huge speaker. She spoke all over the country, really. I don't know about the world. Well, maybe. My father actually went back to his hometown and spoke in Birkenau, and that was incredible that the townspeople were listening to this. And she actually was a very big speaker. When she moved to New Jersey, she was very involved there too. And Christy, she even spoke in a prison in New Jersey. That was my mother's idea, to go to a prison.
American flag.
Anybody else? And by the way, my sister's on this call.
My mom wants to ask something.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Oh, sure. I think yeah.
I want to thank you so much for your presence. I'm going to cry because it was so cute. No matter how many stories I hear, each one is the way you told the story. It's like in my heart. I'll never ever I get that. Thank you for that. I needed this story. It's just gonna keep me in tune and in front of things. And as you said, when things are serious, you know, I'm gonna be mindful and I have to put myself out there and educate as well. And I learn from you, and I thank you so much.
Thank
What I
you.
wanted to ask you, you had a picture of Nikki. Did you have a picture of your cousin who was Nikki's fiance? What happened to him, your cousin?
Yeah, I'm surprised that didn't come up until now. 80 was an interesting man. You could make movies just about Nikki and 80's relationship. They were very much in love, but he was, like I said, very bold, and he would go out during my mother's hiding time, and he wouldn't come home at night, and they weren't sure, is he picked up by the Nazis or is he just carousing around? And he ultimately never was caught by the Nazis. But then at the end of the war, after the war, when my mother was in a sanatorium, they actually came to visit her because they had gotten married, because they weren't allowed to be married before that. And they got married. However, I don't know how long after that, but even though 80 was not caught by the Nazis during the war, they got him in the end. He killed himself. So it's kind of very sad story. My mother said he was kind of going crazy already during the war. I shouldn't use those words, but something was happening to him, and obviously he couldn't handle it. So he actually killed himself. And Nikki never remarried. She was always staying in that same apartment, and that was it.
I have a question. So my mother was a Kindertransport child. She was 12 years old and was put on it and went to England. And I also grew up with her stories. Not so much my father's stories. He was a little more taciturn, but my mother, always grew up with the stories. But I always had the sense that she felt like she was neither fish nor fowl.
You mean like other survivors?
Yes.
Yeah.
That she was,
Yes.
she didn't really feel like she fit into people that survived the camps.
Yes. That was a very big thing in our family, yes. They call it the hierarchy of suffering, like who suffered more. And it's true. People would not validate my mother, even though, believe me, she suffered and we suffered. So,
and I think
I'm saying they needed that validation and they weren't getting it. And the camp survivors would say, "Oh, what do you know? What do you know?" And my mother would say, the fear, like children would ask her, "Were you ever bored during those 3 years?" She had no TV, no books, no internet, no nothing. She says, "No, I was never bored because I was just terrified every minute of every day." Wow. And so that just shows you the suffering. It's almost like, better if you're just caught already, because she could relax finally. And she had nobody to be there with her. It's not like she had other people around her suffering with her so much. So there's a lot about it that I can relate to what you're saying. Yes. And there was, she had the Hidden Child Foundation, what was a hidden child? These people were already older, but they all identified as hidden children. So she died. I still think of her as a hidden child. And once they found kind of a group, I guess it was better for them. And the same thing with Kindertransport. My mother was like the Kindertransport, but with a big difference that she was by herself. And her destination was just the Netherlands. She wasn't going to England. But of course, she knew many people who were on the Kindertransport.
So, I mean, this is.
Yeah, you're right.
I was asked by a friend to join the board of the Holocaust Education Center in Providence, where I live. And at first, and my mother died a couple of years ago. She had Alzheimer's, but something she never forgot. And so I was a little bit reticent because, but now and at the Holocaust Center.
What?
At the Holocaust Center in Providence.
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't be.
The new executive asked me to put together a story about my mother. I have all these papers at home. You know, I have a whole room full of papers. You know,
Okay, well, you should definitely do it because the stories mean a lot more when they're coming from somebody who really lived it.
so you
And-
inspired me.
Oh, I'm
You know,
glad, thank you.
when
Because they
when she
really
said
make
that to me,
more of an impact when it's coming from somebody who can say, this was my family. I wanted to tell you, when I was at the museum in Washington and I saw the picture of the buses on the wall, of course I knew it was there, but I looked for it and there was some strange woman standing next to me. I said, those people saved my mother. The woman almost fell on the ground. Because, you know, here you are looking at pictures. Who are these people? But I was giving her personal connection. So, yes, I would say definitely do it.
Can I say something, Debbie?
Yeah.
Psychologists have done studies of children who are Holocaust survivors, and it's very difficult. You have an entire set of problems, you know, are related to that fact.
I have
They're
no problems.
Right? If related to that.
I have no problems.
Neither do I. But it's interesting
But
because you
it's
seem,
true.
yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, we talk about intergenerational trauma, and they say that the trauma goes down 7 generations, which I don't know if that's true, but it definitely went down to our generation. And especially because my parents spoke about it a lot. It's a big part of our lives. And unfortunately, I think transmitted it to my kids. And what can I tell you?
Can I add something too? This is Evelyn, her sister, who also does Holocaust education, that we both feel, and thank Debbie, this is wonderful, amazing. You really inspire all of us. And I think that what we're trying to do is to inspire other second generation to tell the stories, because you know, we feel like we're honoring our parents when we do that every single time. And it's just so, it helps us with our trauma that we got. So I think it is really, you know, great that you're doing this, Debbie. And can I just add one thing about Dad? I got to go back with him to Germany when he spoke at his former high school, and he asked the students there, how many of you have been to Israel? And this is 99, I think it was. I would have thought 0. Half the class raised their hand. They had a connection to Israel. So it's just, there's a lot of hope.
I hope so.
Beautiful. Thank you. I'm happy to hear your voice as well, Evelyn. And Greta also has a question to ask.
Hi, I just want to first say thank you for your talk because it was very informative, but also like really like unique and just giving like, you know, another personal experience, you know, your family's experience and your experience. I was wondering, with your mom's like young, like teenage age, like how do you, like if you could like elaborate more on how you think that like impacted her experience of the Holocaust, you know, what she went through?
Because she was a teenager? Well, it was very, very rough. She spent, you know, a lot of her teenage years in hiding without being able to experience anything and without being able to go to school or anything. So she always felt like she wanted to get more of an education when she finished. She did get a GED at the end, and she wanted all of her kids to get educated. And of course, we all got higher degrees and all that. I mean, you know, she valued education very highly and felt like people shouldn't take it for granted. When I speak to schools, I try to tell them, don't take it for granted that you're in school here, because my mother wasn't able to do anything, and she would have loved to be able to open a book and study for something, but she wasn't able to. So it was very tough, you know. Her having to say goodbye to her parents at that young age was very difficult, and you know, kind of never got over. She never was able to have real closure, because you don't have a place to bury them or, you know, nothing like that. Although the crazy thing is, I'm in Miami Beach. I live mostly in Miami Beach now and partly in Long Island. And we have the Holocaust Memorial in Miami Beach. And the craziest thing is that my grandparents' names are on the Holocaust Memorial in Miami Beach. My grandparents. We had no connection to Miami Beach at the time. It was just that my mother knew the memorial was being built, and she submitted their names at the time. And so they're there. So I feel like it is a place that I could honor my grandparents. You know, I don't have a cemetery or anything, so I have that. But thank you for the question.
We've got to wrap up pretty soon, but I see April is eager to add one more comment. So let's go to April and then we'll wrap it up. Just make sure, yeah.
Debbie, my question is, what happened to the box with the photos?
So my mother, when she came out of hiding, she had specifically buried it by a tree so she would remember where it was. So she dug it up and she opened the box and she was able to get the photos were still okay. The autograph book was okay. It's really a miracle, I guess. I mean, she must have put it in plastic or something, I guess. but it is a miracle that it all survives.
That's great.
She went back to Vienna. She went back to Vienna when she came out of hiding.
No. No. She was in the Netherlands after when she came out of hiding, and she didn't go back to Vienna until many, many years later. When she was already in the United States, she took a trip to Vienna years later.
Where did she bury the box? In Vienna?
The box
Was it in
the Netherlands when she went into hiding? Before she went into the hiding, she put it outside in the ground, and that's where the box was. Yeah. No, she didn't bury it in the Netherlands. Maybe that was confusing.
Debbie, thank you so much for sharing your mother and father's story with us and demonstrating so well how important these stories are to keep and how powerfully they can be told. Really a lovely presentation. And, you know, it's just nice to hear the stories about your parents, even though we know it's a horrific story. I want to thank Michael Mantell for being our co-host today. And I want to thank all of you for joining us as well. I hope to see you at some of our other programs soon. So have a good night and thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Soren.
Thank you.
Thank you.